Abbiamo di nuovo sforato i tempi dell'intervallo. Naturalmente. Allora, adesso ci sarà Diane Emerson.
Okay, we now have the second speaker, and we will be talking about eye pointing. Thank you so much.
Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be here and to get... No, not working? Hello, everybody. Can you hear me? No. Do I need to move over there?
Well, maybe they just have to switch off the mic on the table.
Is the translation working?
Oh, yes, it's working. Yes. No, I can hear you in English. I can hear you in English. You speak in English?
Doesn't look like there's anybody out there. Yeah. Cosa? Hello? Is that any better? Yes? Okay. Okay, so I want to just start by making a comment in response to, I think it was Anthony's question about what can we do about this situation that we are all in. And so when I became involved in facilitated communication, which just to make Rosemary feel even older was 26 years ago, when I went to see Rosemary, my response to the situation was we need to do research, we need to get published, we need to get the message out. Now I have to say that I've become rather disillusioned on that point, and I think there's a lot of other things that we can do, which you all are doing, which are not necessarily pure research. But I'm going to report briefly on some work that my colleague Andy Grayson and I did, which he presented some years ago in Florence. So if it starts sounding very familiar to any of you, that's because you did hear this once before. But I'm going to present it because it's the basis of what Julia and Giovanni are now working on in many ways, and it brought us together. So what we wanted to look at was not this pure measurement of whether somebody does or does not author their communication. So all the things that we've been talking about to do with message passing and trying to get hard measures of ability and competence, we wanted to do something a little different. We started from the point that we did completely accept that people were able to communicate. I had been doing this for some years by the time I met Andy, and I knew that facilitated communication was very powerful and very effective. So we wanted instead to look at how does it happen? So it's something to do with the process rather than the outcome. And that's what's on this title here. So the importance of description, and I'm going to explain a little bit about why we thought that was important. So the reason for us focusing on this is because most of the psychological literature, as you well know, up until the point, up until now almost, is about measuring outcomes that people have on a particular task. So we have an expectation that people will either be successful or they won't. And we look at percentages and we're saying, as you've seen, well, people can do very well, people can pass tests at very high levels, but we still are, in a way, having to conform to the thing that we're also trying to criticize. So we're trying to criticize notions of intelligence or ability measured by test, but we're forced to still do those things. So this was to try to get away from that and to say, what is actually going on in the relationship between a facilitator and a communicator, and what are participants doing precisely and exactly when they are typing. So we value that because it allows us to describe a natural phenomenon. So we are looking at it as it happens. And we get away from the idea that there should be a norm, or there should be a set expectation that if you get over 50%, you're in, over 60%, you're in. We just wanted to move from that. And one of the reasons we felt that was really important is because when you look at what is published, it mostly comes out against facilitated communication, because it is measuring FC constantly against this norm of that everybody's communication should be effective 100% of the time. And we found that when we analysed the literature, nobody was really interested in the process. And yet what we felt, myself as a facilitator, Andy as an observer, was that it was so possible to observe and see fascinating processes. And for me, one of the reasons that I got into FC in the first place is because I was sort of forced to observe it by a teacher who was very keen that I see what she was doing. And I noticed things that didn't make sense if all of my training up to that point, everything I had been taught, if that were true, then what I was seeing didn't make sense. And this has been my experience over the years, that we deal with a lot of what's called cognitive dissonance, where people have been trained, schooled into a way of seeing the world. And then when they are confronted with somebody communicating who they did not expect could communicate, they get a lot of discomfort, cognitive dissonance. And some people in that situation will embrace it and say, okay, what I learned before was wrong. Some people take a long time on that process because it's painful and difficult, and some stick rigidly to what they were taught and refuse to see. So I think what Rosemary was just showing to us with the government is so powerful, because first of all, they were refusing to see the reality, and then gradually they have shifted. So the message about how do we change things is this constant pushing against the barriers that we are all facing. So in the literature, FC users very rarely, in the tests that were done, provided responses that actually would count as correct. And there were in our reading of it, there were lots of reasons for that. So I remember in a course I was doing, needing to analyse a paper. That was an exercise to analyse a paper. So I analysed a paper that had been published on FC, where at the back of the paper, they presented the results of their tests. And what I could see was a very clear pattern where a question would be asked and the answer would be given, which was incorrect. But if you looked 2 answers later, there would be the answer to the question that was asked previously. But those were all scored as fails, and that seemed ridiculous. So this is the sort of thing that we were looking at and that formed the way that we thought about this work. So we wanted to not do these are Andy's slides, by the way, and his highlights. So he says clever experiments which neatly test a hypothesis. He is sort of, in a sense, being ironic about the psychology discipline, which is what we're trying to do, is have these experiments that are our gold standard of evidence. So we disagree with a lot of the research that is out there. We think that it is methodologically flawed, that it's inaccurately reported, and that's why we're in this situation where papers get published which are not very good, whereas a lot of our papers that are more rigorous and have a different outcome don't get published. So what we acknowledge is that facilitated communication is a complex interactional process. As you all know, it is very involving of at least two people. And you cannot just take the facilitator out of the equation as they used to try to do in some tests and put some kind of mechanical device in instead. That really doesn't work. So we were examining our impressions that we had from observing facilitated communication in action. And because of Andy's background and interest in eye tracking, we decided that this might allow us to somehow quantify what was impressionistic. So when we watched communicators typing, we could see a lot of engagement with their eyes. Now, part of that was we had really listened to Rosemary's diktat, if you like, from the past, which said you must train eye gaze, you must look at what you're pointing at. So we had a large number of people that we could include in our study who were very good at looking, as I have been watching all of you doing. You really look so clearly. So yeah, we had this positive impression of the relationship between looking and pointing, but we wanted to really examine that in a very methodological way. And so our research question was, is it possible that FC users who do not pass message passing tests, we had tried them and our participants hadn't been able to pass them. Our participants were not showing independent evidence of literacy. They had very limited expressive communication skills and were generally described as having severe intellectual disabilities. That's not what we thought about them, that was the description from elsewhere. So was it possible that they could show evidence of literacy and communication skills when we analysed their behaviour in detail? So we started with 35 participants in our study. They were from the UK and from Germany. And most of our participants, we asked people to come forward if they didn't have independent communication beyond very basic abilities. Most of the participants, because of where our funding came from, were people with a diagnosis of autism. It was only because of that funding issue. But then we had a very difficult situation where this was in the early days of eye tracking, where people had to wear a lot of very intrusive stuff on their head. And so either people couldn't tolerate it and had to be discounted, or we couldn't actually get the technology to work. So it was very complicated to get the calibration of the eye camera tracking where the eye was looking to a good level. So that explains why we ended up with fewer participants. And also one person we decided, because we needed to have conservative measures of efficacy, one person was really too good in their independent skills. So we were left finally with 8 people, and this is what they had to cope with. So we were very aware that in a small hot room in the lab, and we actually travelled with our lab. It was interesting when we went around Germany with huge amounts of equipment. Now eye tracking is really easy, but this was quite brave in a sense. It was so complicated. So you had to have the person, the communicator, sitting here with something on their head, with a sensor on a baseball cap. That was the sort of least intrusive we could make it. Their facilitator sitting to whichever side was preferred. And then we had the monitor, and we had to ask people to do a different kind of facilitated communication. Although we wanted to capture what was natural, for the purposes of this, we had to ask people to point up onto a screen. So again, that was very difficult for a lot of people, and we had lots of practice time, but it was still asking them to do something more tiring and more stressful. And we had the camera, the two cameras, which you'll see in a minute. Mostly we encouraged people to just type about what they wanted to, because again, this idea of getting naturalistic data. And the two cameras were looking at the pointing movement and the eye movement. So we had two tracks that we could then join together to synchronize. But we also had to make a decision about what would count as looking at a letter. So this is, again, it's a long time ago. Technology was not as precise as it is now. So we didn't decide that people had to look spot on the letter, because we had a lot of difficulties with calibrating. So we had letter plus the surrounds that counted as a fixation, right? So a fixation is when somebody would focus their eyes on a particular point. And we could, with this technology, we could look at the length of a fixation as well as the direction of a fixation. We then had to manually code the movements. And this is, I still remember how long and boring this was. So we had to watch the point start to move, record where that was, record when it touched the screen, and we had more than one person looking at this so that we could get a good inter-rater reliability. So we're asking the question, are looking and pointing systematically related? And the first thing you need to do is say, well, if they're related, it could be by chance. We need to have some kind of model to see whether this is at chance level or not. But we have no control group, which you would typically have in this kind of experiment, because there's no normative data. So Andy, being a genius, developed this model, which I'm not going to explain because I would get it wrong. But my summary of it is that a calculation was made for each individual based on the entire data set for them that allowed us to calculate the level of chance of looking and typing happening if it wasn't deliberate, right? So we want to know what the chance is so we can measure whether it's higher than chance. And we asked whether the probability of a fixation on a to-be-typed letter before it was touched would be higher than chance. So it isn't just looking at a letter, but it's looking at significant letters. It's looking at letters that are going to be part of a sentence, that are going to be touched. And our data, we'd gone down from 35 people we started with to 8, and then we had a set of data for 7 people where we could say, that that these are all significant levels where people were looking at a particular letter before it was touched at a level greater than chance. Now, I'm going to play a video. Julie, I might need to just get you to do this. So in this video clip, I probably play it twice because it's in real time and it's fast. You can see just hold on. You have to be on the... Shall I do it? You just have to be on the screen and then it should just load up. But give me a second. So you'll see...
Okay, ready?
Oh, okay. Okay. They're going to type the sentence, because I am interested. So you'll see the finger down here touching on the screen, and you'll see the eye movement up here. And you can see if you can get an impression of whether they are in synchrony or not.
E, C, A, U, S, E, because, space, I, space, A, M, space, I, N, T, E, R, E, S, T, E, D, full stop.
Do you want to see it again? Is it worth seeing again?
Okay, ready? B, E, C, A, U, S, E, because, space, I, space, A, M, space, I, N, T, E, R, E, S, T, E, D, full stop.
So I'm not sure whether when you watch that, whether you think that it is in synchrony or not, and whether you can tell whether the point comes first or the eye movement comes first, because that's the big question. We have to consider whether these two things are related, and we have to ask ourselves, if they are related, in what way are they related? So first of all, is it by chance? And statistically, we already had evidence that it was greater than chance. Secondly, the FC user might be looking in order to direct their finger, which would be an indicator that they are authoring what they're saying. But the skeptics would also ask, is it that their finger's being guided and their eyes are following their finger? So that was the next thing that we needed to look at. And for this, we looked at a lot of timings of fixations on the to-be-touched letters. And again, we were able to show that the length of fixation was longer. So the length of fixation for a letter that was going to be typed was longer than those that wouldn't. So it makes a lot of sense. Your eyes move around the screen all the time, looking for the right letter. When you see the letter that you're going to type, you fix on it for longer before you then move to the next one. And I will show you, I'll come back to that in a second. No, okay. Okay, I'm going to show you this and then go back. So what we could see, and particularly for this participant, is a pattern of looking before moving at all. And when I do remember the moment when I saw this pattern in the data, and I was on a train doing my analysis, and I had to ring Andy because I was so excited. And I couldn't get him on the phone, and I was wanting to run up the carriage and talk to people about it. So what I could see is while he was paused before typing, he looked first at here. So each of these has a number on it, so you can track the order of the looking. And what this person is about to type is the word hope. So you see number one here, this one, is within the look zone for H, just about. Then over here to the E, then back over there to the P, and then to the E, before starting to move at all towards the first letter H. So this was very clear evidence of forward planning. There's another one as well, which was the word dangerous. This is harder to see because the letters are on top of each other, but it's the same thing. Before starting to type the word dangerous, participant A was able to look at every one of those letters, or very, very close to every one, to plan. It's almost like to plan his attack on the keyboard. So our data was able to show that people looked at letters before they started to move, that the fixations when they looked at those letters were longer. And what was for us very interesting is that when we looked at the pattern of the relevant and non-relevant looking, so the pink line here is the letters that were not going to be typed. They were just searches. The blue line is the letters that are going to be typed. We would see a pattern of a longer fixation at this point each time. And when we put the line in for where the touch happened, this was happening very regularly before the touch. So they would look at the letter they were about to touch for a good long time and then move their finger towards it. So for 7 people, we were able to very reliably show that they were looking before pointing. So this could not be explained by facilitator influence. And therefore, in the study that we published, firstly, we published one study about participant A because the data was so extraordinary. We then subsequently tried to publish the study on the rest of the data, but we were not successful in that. But for this man particularly, it was unequivocal. He is the author of his communication, but he had still been, as Rosemary was talking about earlier, described as having severe intellectual disabilities, and at the time he was in his 30s. So it had been wrong for a very long time. So the implications, just to round up, are that lots of effects are invisible in real time. It's really difficult to get somebody to watch these videos and say, yes, categorically, one thing happens before the other. But through this, we've been able to show that there is a strong relationship, and looking happens first and then pointing. And this is consistent with what you would expect if somebody was a competent one-finger typist. And I'm going to skip to the last thing. So in our work, eye tracking was able to tell us about the process of FC. But what I wondered a lot, and I want to leave you with a question really, is that I then really wondered whether actually, as well as teaching typing, we were teaching eye gaze. And therefore, could we turn this all around, and could we type pointing in order to type eye gaze, in order that people have independent communication through eye gaze technology rather than through pointing, which would be more independent and less problematic. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Volevo chiedere, perché forse non ho capito bene.
Let me ask you a question. You show that the look of the guy, basically the guy was looking all the letters before starting to type. Is it correct? I just want to have confirmation. Okay. So he was actually finding all the letters of the word, and then he was typing in the correct order, right? So basically, he read the whole word his way, and then he started to type in the correct order.
Okay. Grazie.
And then as he typed it, he looked at the letters again. But he was the only person in our data who did this forward planning. The rest of the people looked at one letter, pointed to it, looked at the next one, pointed. But he was actually planning, the whole word.
Thank you.
Allora, adesso io e Giovanni vorrei...
Okay, so now myself, Giovanni, and Suvo, if you wanted to come to stage, we would like to present you a work which is actually a spin-off of the work presented by Anne and the work done with Andy. Well, the technology they used, of course, had some limits when it comes to calibration, but today technologies are much more advanced and calibration is much easier. So when, there is a movement of the head, the calibration is not lost. And so together with the University of Nottingham, we could carry out this study, and 13 families from Italy, together with the facilitators and family members, they came to Nottingham to participate in the study. So now I give the floor to Giovanni, who is going to present the setting and the data collection process. And I know that some of the 13 people, involved in the study are here. So some of them are here. So if they want to take the floor at any time to tell about their experience, of course, they are welcome to do that.
Buongiorno a tutti. Allora, sono...
Good morning. I was really impressed by Rosemary's presentation. She mentioned very important issues, and actually I have, some of the same issues in my presentation as well. So I would like to present a study which is actually the assessment of language and counter skills by eye tracking, so eye tracking glasses, and EMG sensors for the deltoid movements and the tracking of the arm position with respect to the screen and to the surrounding space. And of course it refers to people using FC. Now, as Rosemary was saying, we are used to think that lack of language means lack of thinking. And indeed, many people using facilitated communication were diagnosed with intellectual disabilities. And here I'm talking about tests, but they do only work because they confirm competence, skills. And when people fail, so when tests do not confirm the presence of skills, well, tests do not explain us why such a skill is missing. because failing a test cannot just be caused by the lack of a skill, but there is a number of variables that are involved in the test. For example, the working memory or the attention or even the motor planning, which can interfere with the fulfillment of the task. And this is what Professor Silver said. Even the simplest and most automatic task might be influenced by the co-occurring of a different activity. So this is our opinion about tests. So we have to, maintain attention and also, understanding our, position into the space. We have to be focused and concentrated. So the answer, the response to the test might be influenced by all this, and the test might fail. So this is why we decided to carry out this study with two goals. First of all, we wanted to design the real profile of language and math skills of users. So we carried out a quantitative and qualitative analysis, starting from standardized tests. Then we submitted the tests in a number of experimental conditions to see whether there were any differences in terms of independence or facilitations, and also concerning the touch. So, as I said, 13 FC users came to Nottingham for the test, for the experimentation. We used the BADA test for the language assessment in adults, which is mainly used in case of aphasia, and that was the type of test was selected. Not really for the skills which are assessed, but in particular for the length of the options and the items which are proposed in the test. So basically, we could split this depending on experimental conditions. So we asked our users to be independent in the answers, so without facilitation, and then with facilitation, and then with touch, contralateral touch or same arm but no facilitation. And with other users, we use like a physical restraining before starting. Now, we monitored all this using eye tracking glasses to track, every single moment where eyes were looking at. We also used EMG sensors on the deltoid of the arm, and they were positioned both on the user and facilitator, and the same applies to glasses, and motion sensors on the forearm of the user and the facilitator. And the motion sensor gives a plot, for every single moment of the position of the arm. These are the results as to the first goal, which is the assessment of language and math skills. Here you have the recap table. So in a condition of facilitation by touch, there is no difference, and the percentage of correct answers is almost 100%. In the condition of independence, despite of a very high percentage of correct answers, so 70%. However, there is a significant difference with respect to the facilitation condition and touch condition. And this difference is statistically significant. And this is especially interesting because even if we think that with the facilitation, the user is influenced, well, actually, we cannot explain why this happens, only when we have a simple touch by the facilitator. Okay, then we analyzed the language and math skills profile, and then our second goal was to identify any differences between facilitation and touch with respect to independence or autonomy. So we made a twofold analysis. First, we considered the speed of pointing, so basically from the return position to the touch on the screen. And we also analyzed the muscles activation peaks of both facilitator and user, and we created a connection, a relationship with the movements of the user. Now, as to the differences in speed, you have two participants, so P2 and P3. You can see that in a condition of facilitation, the speed of pointing is much lower if compared to the autonomy condition. So it is much slower. There is a 3.5 difference if compared to the same activity carried out autonomously. But when we have facilitation, the speed drops twice as much. Okay, then we further analyzed the movement, and we divided the space. So we have the rest position, and from the rest position to the screen in four, let's say, portions to see whether accelerator and where acceleration happened. And the results say and confirm that acceleration is higher in the very last part of the movement where the finger is very close to the screen. And this is interesting as well because it's like, the movement is frozen, so there is a sort of a loss of the rhythm of pointing. And if you consider keyboard, when you have a number of options, well, this also explains how difficult it is to type on a keyboard autonomously, because there is a slowing down, which means that typing is much slower, and having memory of our thoughts and words is difficult, and also planning the next movement is difficult because there is a lot of effort and attention which is required because of that. Then we looked at the muscles activation of the facilitator. And in all participants, the muscles activation of the facilitator was 3 to 4 times less than the user. So the facilitator doesn't do much, whereas while the user is, answering the question. So the red line indicates the muscles activity of the user, whereas the line in yellow represents the muscles activation of the facilitator. Okay, you might think, there is an important difference, a high difference, but, it is also true that the movement is completely different because, the user is pointing to the keyboard, whereas the facilitator is just supporting the arm of the user, so you can't compare the two motions. Okay, so in order to, prevent this criticism, we carried out, further analysis. We divided the movement into 4 parts. So moment 0 is the start of the movement, and number 4 is the end of the movement. And we actually identified the peaks in the effort of the facilitator. So, for example, P2, you see that the facilitator's peak is roughly, right in the middle of the movement, whereas when it comes to P4, the peak is much earlier, and in P6 is basically in between the second and fourth. Okay, so based on the peaks, facilitators' peaks. Now, the question was, do these peaks of activation influence or modify the direction of movement, the direction of pointing? Now, to answer this, we analyzed the lateral movements of the user. You know that motion sensors give a 3D analysis of the movement. So we have the y-axis, so back and forth movement, and the z-axis, it's a vertical movement, whereas the x-axis is the lateral movement. This is specifically interesting because the options are basically along the x-axis, so either to the left or to the right. So pointing the answer to the right gives a trajectory on the chart which is completely different if compared to the answer pointing to the left. And there are also some motion differences. If you have A as an answer which is on the left, B is in the center, and D is the opposite, so extreme right. So we tried to foresee the movement, and for every single movement we indicated the moment in which the motion could be, let's say, foreseen, 100% sure. So data are expressed in millimeters because we refer to space. So you see that answer A is 16.54 millimeters from point 0, which is the point of calibration of sensor, whereas answer D is 152.94 millimeters, and basically nobody answered C when moving the arm in this direction. So based on that, we also looked at the time in which the direction of the movement could be foreseen, and we looked at the facilitator's peaks. So you see that the decision of the movement happens before the facilitator's peak. So the facilitator's peak arrives when the direction has already been decided by the user towards the correct answer, of course. And such a result, well, of course, creates problems if you believe that with FC, the facilitator influences the movement of the user, because, well, the signal sent to the user actually happens before the movement. I mean, this is what people say. But if, in a test situation, we have just two answers, well, we can accept it. But when it comes to writing, you have multiple choices, and, letters are positioned in different positions on the keyboard. So this means that, the signal by the facilitator is very accurate when it comes to the movement destination. But we know that, and we confirmed through this survey, that the movement is absolutely voluntary and independent by the FC user. So in this case, the influence by the facilitator must be very, very accurate and must happen before the movement. And I think this is it. And I give the floor to Giulia. I hope everything is clear. I know some parts are a bit complex, but I mean, it took time, to me as well to understand everything, but I hope it was clear enough.
E se poi
Now, can you tell us the difference between facilitation and touch? What is the difference between the two? Well, I can't, define it, but I can tell you what we asked facilitators to do when we asked them, to do a facilitation or rather a touch. Now, touch is just a hand on the body of the user, but the hand doesn't do anything. Whereas facilitation is what happens during facilitation. So I can't define it because I'm not a facilitator. Let me give you an example. If the person was facilitating this way, the touch was having the hand here. If the person was facilitating like that, the touch was on the other arm. So every single case was different, and we tried to have the highest difference, between the two. So of course there is always variability, when it comes to facilitation. There were, for example, people that were doing this. So facilitation was at the forearm, but then they moved backward, and the touch was just a hand on the neck. I think this is very important because not really for us, but for people criticizing, FC. Now, having said this, I have another question. Maybe this is for Professor Suvo. Okay, so we have facilitation on one side and touch on the other. And the difference is not so important, but can we explain it by what you said yesterday, which is that, a touch creates support to the balance, to the space orientation. So, the person is more focused and can do an autonomous voluntary movement.
I think the question is about the difference between a pure touch that would give postural support. I'm sorry, can you hear me now? Yeah. The question is about the difference between just providing postural support on the trunk versus providing support that includes some assistance in making the arm movement. Now, both of those, as you will have noticed in my talk yesterday, they are both components of being able to produce the activity that the participant is intending. The postural support is important for programming the arm movement, but the precision of the arm movement is also a separate job. That has to be done on top of a calibrated postural frame. So the expectation, without knowing anything about these results, would be that if touch is helping people program their movements more efficiently, then there should be a staged effect. The smaller effect should be only when there is postural support provided, because that gives part of the job that needs to be done some assistance. So if there is some postural support provided, then the body is able to frame the arm movement better, because some assistance has been given about the position of the trunk with respect to the keyboard. A higher level of benefit would be expected if there is some assistance in making the movement itself on top of that, because that's a job that still needs to be done over and above the stabilization of the posture. So one would expect the kind of pattern that you're seeing here, which is a certain amount of effect from just touch. That's better than no touch at all, but a bigger effect in terms of benefit if that touch is then supplemented by some assistance with the arm. Now, I might anticipate a little bit some of the results that you'll see in Julia's presentation, but the benefit of getting some support on the arm as it is pointing to specific keys will also be different at different points in the movement that is being made. And so there'll be more benefit right around the point at which the key is being pressed, because that is the point at which highest amount of precision is involved, and the person needs to use feedback from their vision and their body to be able to judge the exact position where the key needs to be hit. And so you would expect that if there is the facilitator's arm is helping the facilitator's activity on the participant's arm is helping, then that activity will probably be focused more around the point at which the specific key is being pressed. So it's a precision issue where the benefit will come. And what you shouldn't see then is a lot of facilitator activity when the arm is moving in the direction of the key, but more activity when that fine-tuning is being done right near the key. I hope that helps clarify a bit. There'll be some more data that shows that.
Una brevissima nota pratica.
Now, just a piece of information. Many people asked me to get the presentations, and we will share the presentations. I will send the presentations in the next days to you. And I have the mailing list, but if you don't get them, you can, write an email to us and we will send them to you. Now, I have two questions for you. Well, first of all, if you want to tell us something about your experience in coming to Nottingham, of course, we would be glad to listen to you. But I have two more specific questions. Well, first of all, a question about the influence of facilitators. So, do you think that the facilitator has an influence on what you do? And secondly, what does the facilitator do? I know it's easier to tell us what you do, basically. And Luca, I'm asking an extra effort for you because I want to know what Barbara does, but not right in this moment. I want to know what she used to do in the past. So what do you think about she's doing?
Allora, premetto che tutte le analisi che presentiamo adesso...
So, first of all, I have to say that the analyses are just preliminary. We still have to double check the results. And the charts are based on raw data, which hasn't been normalized. So I think that during the next meeting, I will provide, the normalized results. However, before looking at data and presenting data, I would like to mention two terms. First of all, influencing and assisting. We all deal with communication. We know that when there is an interaction among two persons, well, there is verbal feedback, face expressions, the tone of the voice. This means that there is a mutual interaction between two people, talking to each other. So when two human beings, any age, normally developed or not, even speaking different languages, when people speak, there is always mutual interaction when they speak to each other. And this is especially true when it comes to education, because if we have a learner on one side and an adult, for example, or if I say to my child, you do that, you don't do that, well, I'm influencing my child in a very active way, and this is normal. We all know this, but I mean, before presenting the results, I wanted to point this out. So by influencing, we means, I mean, putting the words right in the mouth of a person. So basically, if we consider FC, well, the thought of the user is indeed the thought of the facilitator, whereas assistance or assisting means supporting and helping the user to say what he or she really wants to say. There is literature, and the first works were published, ages ago about movement. And this is the very first study. I think it was actually a PhD dissertation, and well, there is a definition of the type of movement. So the user has to do this movement towards a specific item. So the user had to point the item. So the first part of the movement was fast and very similar between the different users, whereas the second part of the movement was characterized by sub-movements. There were differences among participants and the speed was reduced. Okay, that was the first study, and now indeed we can actually split the movement in a first phase, the ballistic phase, where the movement is pre-planned and I do not have to adjust or correct any errors or mistakes. So this is most of the movement. I'm almost reaching the target. Whereas the final part of the movement is actually a closed loop movement, which means that I base my movement on feedback and I adjust the mistakes I have made. Okay, now based on this definition, we should look at data. And as Giovanni was saying, we collected quite complex data. He presented the results of the tests on language and math scales, whereas now I'm presenting you preliminary data on FC. So we asked, our people in lab to talk about anything. So using FC in a most natural way possible when it comes to content. And the very first question was, what kind of activations do we expect if everything is about influencing, which means that the facilitator is influencing the user. So the facilitator is moving the arm of the user. So what kind of pattern we would expect? Well, maybe we would expect something like this. We have a periodical repetition of a line, which is very similar to this one. So we have a stronger activation at first during the ballistic phase, and then we have the final adjustment. However, regardless of the shape of the curve, we would expect a periodical repetition. So for when a letter is typed, the facilitator makes the same action. So that was our first question. So what kind of pattern would we expect if the facilitator moves the arm of the user? Now, what kind of data did we consider? Well, first of all, 245 microsessions were taken into account. These are 3 to 4 minute sessions, and we used EMG data. In 234 cases, there was no, pattern, activation pattern, compatible with, the idea that the facilitator is moving the arm. In 11 sessions, there were some moments in which this pattern appeared, but a very low percentage, only 4.5%. I can't say what is going on, during these 11 sessions because I still have to finish looking at the videos. But however, most of this happens at the end of, for example, a 2-hour session. But I mean, I will confirm it in in 2 years, during the next meeting once I have finished analyzing data. So in most of the cases, we couldn't find this, repetition pattern, which indicates that the facilitator moves the arm of the user. On the contrary, we found situations similar to this one. So we have the facilitator's activation, and actually the average is 1/3 or 1/4 of the user using the technique, with some peaks which have different shapes. We can have multiple peaks or single peaks. So basically, these peaks mean that the facilitator is doing something. This is the facilitator, yes. These are the facilitator's activation patterns. Now, the data refers to the 13 participants, 245 microsessions. Basically, all users are included. My question is about peaks. Did they occur for all participants, for all users? Well, if the question is, did you find peaks for every session, for every user? Well, I have to say no, because in some cases peaks are more frequent. I couldn't find any session with no peaks. However, there are differences. There is a huge variability among users. So right now, I can say, that, there were no patterns indicating that the facilitator is, influencing or moving the arm. But of course, we also have to look at the what the facilitator does, because we could ask the users, does the facilitator guide the arm? No. If the answer is no, so the question is, what is the facilitator doing? And I'm trying to give you an explanation of what we think the facilitator is doing actually. So when I realized that, there are activation moments, I watched the videos, and I just wrote down what I saw when the activation happened. Personally, I try to classify these types of activations, and I have to say that most situations in which there is a facilitator's activation correspond to 3 moments: either a return gesture, or lateral movements on the keyboard, or the search for the keyboard. So you're very close to the letter, and you have to pick one letter when you have 2 or 3 letters on the keyboard. For example, most of activations were found on the left-hand side on top of keyboard, but I have to say that, generally speaking, they occur everywhere. And when looking at the activation patterns, I found differences among participants. In these cases, the assistance by facilitator was higher for lateral and return movements. P7 has a star, which means the user participated in the message passing test as well. So you saw the results yesterday, which are extremely positive. So it is also interesting to see that in some cases, like P7, there is a high assistance by facilitator. In this case, we have a very high percentage of message passing. Okay, the charts have disappeared. I do apologize. I'm looking for the charts. In the meantime, we will read our users' answers. So Chiara wrote, facilitation prevents ineffective movements. It guides my arm and makes me more accurate. But this is it. It does not affect my thoughts, that's for sure.
Of those little cables to connect a Mac computer to the screen. Is that right? Could I borrow that? Because it's not showing my graphs here. Sorry.
Allora,
To me, the difference between facilitation and touch is minimum. At first, when I started using FC, my mom was very anxious, and I was lucky that I started to work with my sisters and also with other facilitators. So, mom, she was, more calm, and she was kind of scared of influencing me. But then, we fixed the problem, and personally, I was looking for such weird words on the keyboard, then she was sure that she wasn't influencing me.
se sono stata così, complimenti. Lasciamelo dire. Sì?
Però non so come si fa ad attivare.
Guarda, proprio basta così, meno male.
Posso leggere? Va bene, allora leggo.
Let me read the answer. I do not speak that much, but I think that, I'm really glad and happy that I was part of the study, of the survey.
Ok, ci siamo coi grafici ora. Quindi dicevamo, in questi casi c'è una maggiore
Okay, so we would say that in these cases, there is a higher assistance by the facilitator. And here you can see the activation by facilitator. So the x-axis represents the lateral range or the back and forth range, whereas the y-axis indicates the number of times that movement occurred. So, for example, 62 times we saw the lateral movement from 0 to 10 millimeters. Orange color means activation of the facilitator. The dark brown is where the facilitator is not active. So what we see here is that when the facilitator is acting, so where we have the peaks, well, these are just micro movements on the keyboard. So in other words, when I was saying, that the first part of the movement is when you plan your movement. Well, in this case, there is no facilitation or assistance by the facilitator, whereas at the end of the movement, where you have the final adjustments of the movement, well, in this case, we have some peaks of the facilitator. So it is like, the facilitator helping in the very last portion, the very last part of the movement, but not at the beginning. So we may infer that, actually choosing the letter or choosing the key, this happens first. And of course, in a keyboard, there is a limited number of letters. limits in number of keys. In particular, when it comes to Italian language, we use actually keyboards having letters which do not exist in Italian, and so this means that the chance of influencing the use of this letter is lower. So when you're very close to the letter, to the key, and there is a very final adjustment, well, these are actually the possible keys that I will press. I hope that was clear. I hope it was clear enough. Now, there are two cases in which we observed less assistance during lateral movements and return movements. One of these two cases is Luca, and the charts show entire sessions where there is just a very micro activation. Based on EMG sensors data, we just know that the facilitator is alive, but doesn't do anything. So you can see here that there are some micro movements for the adjusting of the movement to pick the key, the letter, but the facilitator's activations are very low. There are also some mixed activation patterns. For example, in these two cases, we had this type of mixed pattern. And then we have some participants for which we observed different activations, for example, bimodal activations. So in some cases, the facilitator seems to support, to help the participant, or this type of activation. If you look at the chart on the left-hand side, you see that the facilitator is more active in longer movements if compared to short movements. Okay, based on that, I watched the video clips because I wanted to see what was happening, so why the movement was longer. And most of the movements actually were related to deletion. So basically, when a letter, which is not part of the Italian language, well, deleting it, erasing it was obvious. So basically, the facilitator was helping a little bit more. And that day, it was interesting because I realized that, these activations were part of the erasure of the letters. So also when it comes to the bimodal activations, the second peak seems to correspond to the movements made when deleting the letter. Okay, thank you. Thank you for your attention. This is it for now.
Oh, thank you so much. Now, in the case of an activation with, backward movement, can you say that the activation of the facilitator was there before starting the backward movement? No, well, I haven't talked about this because, I have analyzed, the other issue, which is the lateral movements, but this is a hypothesis, so I'm not sure about this. In that case, we have different situations. There's a modulation of force. So in some cases, both are active, but the movement or the motion is basically down to zero. So this means force modulation, withholding the gesture and something like this. If you work with hypertonic students all of the adaptation work to reach the keyboard. It's a sort of a counter resistance instead of facilitation. This may happen. This is very high level. So what you see on the diagram, well, is that there's a strong activation, of course, but the movement, it's a sort of a counter resistance, so it goes on the other way. So there shouldn't be an equivalence between increasing force or strength and increasing the distance. I think that all facilitators here experienced the fact that you have to, let's say, constrain, so force the arm of the student towards ourselves, so that you can really give, a pace. I've seen some parts. Anyway, I don't have statistics, but in terms of quality, I've seen some pieces, for example, last week, where there's activation from both, and the movement is zero or kind similar to zero for example, 100 milliseconds. But I cannot answer now, so this is not a definitive, answer. This is my question. Did you try to diversify the sample? So those who are right with facilitating communication, which is what Bruno said before. So if you consider, a hypotonic situation, for example, this is what happens in many genetic diseases, or hypertone, which is what happens in cerebral palsy, patterns are different. And if you consider, a tiredness or a fatigue is different. I mean, they get tired in a different way. This means there's a different involvement. And maybe it's worth having two subpopulations. Giovanni, tell me if I'm wrong. I don't think we have anyone with very strong, hypertonus participating in the study, in the trial. We've had two individuals with strong, hypertonus. So there's, so once again, I cannot give you numbers or figures, but you can see an important, tracing. We have peaks up to 4,000 millivolts, only if you have, hypertone. This is something I can really confirm. And we haven't had situations with strong seizures or epilepsy where the hypertone is very strong. I mean, those extreme cases, no, in this case, this is not included in our participants' team. For example, Mario or Esther. So I really would like to take this into account. Maybe we can make a comparison with a light, hypertone, but no, this is something we haven't done yet. So I know that there's a resemblance between the two hypertone cases, maybe because they were a little more extreme than all the other cases. I mean, I saw peaks both sides. I mean, FC users and facilitator. If there's a force modulation, I mean, if you hit me with 4,000 millivolts, so even the fact of withholding, even if you are, you're getting ready to type, I mean, before typing, the activation of the facilitator will be stronger. I would like to read the text written by Maria. This aid or help has shown that what is really helping me is the support. This is my thought all the time.
Mi dicono dalla regia che siamo fuori tempo massimo.
Okay, I'm being told that we are a little too late. Okay, so but after lunch we can be here 5 minutes early and you can write your thoughts. Okay, sorry for this. I do apologize. I mean, it has taken a long time to come here, so I think we need to break for lunch, but we will be ready to continue after lunch. Okay, so you will get 5 minutes off your lunch break.
E visto che
Now I know you're leaving, so I think we can have lunch break now. We can read the very last pieces just before officially starting the afternoon works. Anyway, I really would like to tell you right away that this was absolutely astonishing. Thank you so much. Much, much more than our expectation. Okay, thank you so much. Enjoy your lunch.